Welcome back, Mindful Surrender Yoga, or Waking Up in a Busy World with Nancy. And today we're going to continue with the answering of questions. And so I will, first of all, take a drink of water. My throat is a little scratchy. And then I will proceed to pull out a question from our trusty jar of many questions. Trying to go down to the bottom. And I'll briefly read this question. Okay, I will start my timer. And the question reads, what is the relationship between anxiety and our thinking? What is the relationship between anxiety and our thinking? Take a deep breath. Now, this may be a question better answered by a psychiatrist, psychologist, or a neuroscientist than it is by me, but I will do my best to answer what I believe to be the relationship between anxiety and our thinking. Anxiety, of course, is that feeling that many of us still tend to get when we are nervous, I guess is a word that used to be used. Feeling frightened and afraid, it's a form of fear for sure. Often is generalized, so to the point that we're not actually sure where the anxiety is coming from. We just feel this sense of fear, of terror to some extent sometimes. Feel of their inability to remain safe and secure in the situation or environment that we're in. It becomes a very physiological thing very fast. We'll feel the trembling maybe of our limbs. We may feel our heart beating in our chest rather quickly. We may feel short of breath as we can't catch our breath. We may even have so much pain in our chest or so much heaviness in our chest it feels like we're having a heart attack. In an anxiety attack, that can often be the case. We may feel like butterflies in the belly in the lesser degrees to full-blown feelings of an ulcer, in the greater degrees of anxiety. Anxiety can, like I said, be very generalized. We're not sure what the actual trigger for the anxiety is, or it can be very specified as well, as in a phobia type of situation where we may encounter something we're afraid of, like a snake, for example. Upon seeing the snake or coming in contact with the snake, we may have the reaction that we need to fight or flight in order to survive. And fight or flight, of course, is the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, one of the components of the autonomic nervous system. And it is our stress reaction, primal type of neurological and biochemical reaction that occurs in the body in order to speed everything up or slow what needs to be slowed down in order to equip us with the capacity to either fight whatever the stressor in front of us or run from it. So we have an activation in anxiety, usually severe or more, intense activation of the sympathetic nervous system when we are having anxiety. And it feels like we're out of control. It's probably the biggest thing that anxiety creates in us, is a sense that we're out of control. We're out of control of whatever is going on in our environment. But more than that, we're out of control of what's going on in our internal environment. We just can't seem to stop it or control it. It seems to have a mind of its own. So that's anxiety. And thinking, of course, is our thoughts that occur in our minds. And it is said that we have about 60,000 thoughts a day. It is said that 80% of those thoughts are supposedly negative, and 90% of them are repetitive, meaning that we have a lot of negative thinking in our brains. So we, as a society, are action-orientated, productive, productivity seekers, whether we know it or not, but it's almost culturally conditioned in us to be so. So we're always doing something. So we're either doing something physically or doing something in the head, and I think that's where the 60,000 thoughts a day go. We're constantly thinking, constantly thinking. We have, most of us, what the Buddhists would term monkey minds. Just a bunch of stuff being flung around in the head by monkeys that are challenging to control. So when you have a mind that's constantly active, usually with, negative thoughts that are going around in this loop recording, it's no wonder why we feel anxious at times, right? Why we feel out of control, why we feel overwhelmed. So there is that component that definitely relates to anxiety, but I think we need to look at anxiety maybe first of all as more of a biophysical reaction to a trigger from the external world that somehow creates that primal part of our brain, which is responsible for anxiety, which is very responsible for stress and fight and flight system, of the sympathetic nervous system activation, which is an inherent and ingrained and innate and very, very natural component of being human. And it goes way back to the beginning of our experience here on Earth as creatures that walk, that shows. It is to ensure our survival. So when we have this primal part in our brain, so before we can even think, we may have anxiety. We may have a triggering going on in our body, and the body is responding, ready to act, either fight or flight, because it sees something that it's feared. And anxiety, of course, is an intense and often inappropriate reaction to a trigger because of this primal part of our brain that's being activated. It's almost a vague, some people will call it a vagus or vasomotor response to some degree. It's just happening as a reflex a lot, even before we have a chance to think about it. So we have anxiety on the biological level that can come even before we have thoughts associated with it. Or we can have thoughts like, oh my gosh, I can't do this, or I'm going to fail if I go there and do my driver's test, for example. I'm going to fail, I'm just not competent enough, I'm not going to be able to do this, they're going to think I'm stupid, I'm going to get in an accident, the driving examiner is going to hit me over the head with his clipboard because I'm going to be the worst driver you've ever seen. So these thoughts in our heads definitely can trigger the anxiety reaction, the fear reaction once we actually get behind the wheel to do our driving test. So we do have that. So thinking can definitely lead to anxiety. The negative thoughts we have about ourselves as being incapable and the world as being dangerous and other individuals not liking, being threats to us can create anxiety. Because anxiety, stress, is a result of a perceived threat. So somewhere along the line, when we talk about the anxiety reaction, we either had the body perceiving a threat before the mind did, or the mind perceiving a threat before the body did. But both the thoughts and the physiological feeling of anxiety will become intertwined at some point. So even if it was a biological reaction to a threat, the body just sensed that there was danger and you had that primal reaction, and then the sympathetic system took off. You had the vagus nerve activated, leading to the whole activation of the stress response. Even if that was the case, very, very quickly, within seconds, minutes to seconds, you're going to have the thoughts in there. Oh my gosh, this is dangerous, this is wrong, I'm going to die, or I can't stand this feeling, or I'm going to be overwhelmed by this feeling, or I'm going to be overwhelmed by this situation, or whatever else comes in there, those negative thoughts related to the fear response can be activated by the biological response of anxiety. Or the biological response of anxiety can be activated by the thoughts or the thinking mind that tends to be negative. So we do see definitely a correlation between thinking and anxiety, a relationship, a very strong relationship. Whether or not it's the body causing the anxiety and then the thoughts and therefore causing the thinking, or the thinking causing the anxiety, depends on the situation. And at those times of fear, we're not usually sitting there and, when we're facing the mother lion coming across the field at us, we're not going to sit there and think, is this my thinking or my body causing this feeling? We're just going to want to run, right? Just going to want to run and flee the situation, which is often a very normal reaction to anxiety. is this desire to run from the situation that's causing it or to avoid it. And of course that causes a host of all other problems if we get into avoidance, which is like the second arrow of suffering when it comes to anxiety, is our tendency to want to avoid it at all costs. Can lead to all kinds of bigger issues with anxiety and fear, because fear, whether it's anxiety or some other type of fear, can be really easily shrunk down to size by facing it and confronting it, rather than allowing it to build up into something it isn't when we avoid it and pretend it doesn't exist, or close our eyes to the monsters underneath the bed that we believe are underneath the bed, instead of just looking under the bed to see that there's nothing there. Right? So the question is, how does anxiety relate to thinking, and how does thinking relate to anxiety? And I think it's both. You know, our thoughts do, and I often talk about this idea, and it's Beck and Ellis. Started as rational emotive behavioral therapy and became CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, later on. But it's our thoughts are said to lead to, we have a situation we encounter, it leads to a thought, the thought is said to lead to a feeling, the feeling is said to lead to a behavior. But it's not always that way. Sometimes we'll have a biological, especially when it comes to something like anxiety and fear, a biological, inherent, natural, innate response to a trigger in the environment that somehow the body perceives that it is something of a threat before the mind does. So we can have that leading to the thinking rather than the thinking leading to the anxiety. But regardless, they're together. They're all tangled up together in this big mess of anxiety when we do have an anxious reaction. And the idea eventually is to understand where our anxiety is coming from, understand the physiological response we're having to anxiety, and then understand the thoughts that are in our heads when we are having anxiety reactions. And this usually only occurs after the effect. Like I said, it's hard to think that way when you're in the anxious reaction. And then to gently and gracefully and with a great deal of compassion for self, rephrase those thoughts, cognitively restructure them into something that is more life-affirming, and see if that helps reduce our anxiety. And then in anxiety reactions, there's things we can do physically that will calm the body down so that we're thinking clearer too, like taking a deep breath. And some people are into the vagus nerve, stroking, or some people say, if you bend your head down into cold water when you're having an extreme emotional reaction, will help to bring you back and calm, put the parasympathetic system right into play again. So we can use, we can trick the body into calming down so that the thinking calms down, or we can calm down the thinking so that the body calms down in some cases as well. So regardless of how or why or what we're afraid of or what's causing the anxiety, there is a lot of tools out there that can help us to deal with it. We do not have to be, victims to our anxiety. But the number one thing to do, I believe, is to accept our anxiety instead of resisting it and pretending it's not there and avoiding those circumstances that cause fear. To accept our anxiety, accept our fear as a part of who we are, and just gradually take steps to desensitize ourselves to the things we are afraid of once we become clear what those things are. And it often goes back to our core beliefs. So therefore it requires a lot of restructuring, not only of our thoughts in our conscious mind, but of those beliefs in our subconscious mind as well. And also working with the body. Progressive muscle relaxation can help calm the body down, so that when we are having an anxiety reaction, we can just use a word or a trigger to bring the body back to a parasympathetic state. And, deep breathing, learning to breathe, being mindful, meditation can help with anxiety in the long run. Yoga, I strongly encourage yoga. So there's all kinds of things we can do to prevent our anxiety from taking over our lives. And like all things, we want to really look at our thinking and our minds to see the role it plays in these types of reactions that we're having to life circumstance or to the triggers out there in our worlds. Anyway, that is all I have to say about that. Thank you so much for joining. Namaste.